Hello, everybody. This is the second in a series with Cody. Tonight, he has brought with him Dr. Stephen Herman. Stephen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. And Cody, thank you for inviting me to introduce you this evening. Cody and I met in September of 2023, and he found a book of mine on William James and C.G. Jung, Doorways to the Self, and saw my reference there to the influence of both James and Jung on the development of the founder, Bill Wilson. And what he's done is he's provided us with a part of the story that has been up till now really untold. And it's in the background of the movement of AA. And it began to take shape a few decades before the co-founder of AA, Bill Wilson, became sober in New York in 1934. This is his first big effort to make an impact on the field, and he's only begun to waken Jungians up to our history. And for that, we can commend you, and I'm going to let you take it over from here, Cody. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. So let me share my screen. The thing that strikes me so much. So one day I was reading Carl Jung's letter, and I thought about this last night. And that there's Jung's letter to Wilson. He tells Wilson that he had written a decent and honest letter, and I was really struck by that, because Jung, he commends Wilson for having acquired a point of view above the misleading platitudes one usually hears about religion, and or about alcoholism. Sorry, and that perspective is what really allowed Jung to kind of delve into the sort of psycho-spiritual nature of alcoholism, right? But the kindness that Jung really kind of shows towards Bill Wilson in that letter is something that I have also really felt in the Jungian community. I feel like the modern Jungians, are carrying that mantle of kindness towards, people like me and like Bill Wilson. And I'm just really grateful for that. It's such a good example. Both you and Dr. McCabe was here last session. He was also, equally as kind. And I want to just give my heartfelt thanks to you guys for taking time out of your schedule to be here, and to just it's just so helpful, and I'm so grateful for everything that you've done for me. Specifically, Stephen, you mentored me during this process. You wrote the foreword, which was a huge deal for me, and I appreciate that. And also, Dr. Herman allowed me to bounce ideas off of him regarding sort of this Jungian doctrine or whatever, and so I really got to flesh out just a whole bunch of concepts and everything that I was able to kind of pack into the book. And specifically regarding the essay that Dr. Herman wrote but didn't publish, when he gave that to me and I began to read it, and it just, I was struck by what he just said now, that the Jungians see Jaime from this sort of perspective of having suffered a lot of trauma as a child, and grew up, kind of dealing with that. And me, being a person who's a member of a 12-step fellowship and who has had my own struggles with addiction and alcoholism, I read that and I couldn't help but see it through that lens, right? The lens of my own experience in addiction, and to really sort of, and I, and I've actually spent quite a bit of time talking to sort of, I guess, scholars about Jaime de Angulo. I hope I didn't misspeak there. I'm speaking of Jaime in this, and so and I couldn't help but see Jaime as the alcoholic that he was, right? And I do want to say this too, that having been given the opportunity to present this information to the world. And you know, Dr. Herman allowed me to publish some of the things that he wrote in that essay. And that was honestly, I can say, one of the greatest gifts that I've ever been given. And I really thank you for that. It's been an amazing journey. And that was really the icing on the cake. And I'm so grateful. We all know, so the idea that Jung had a profound effect on Alcoholics Anonymous is something that's fairly well known in 12-step communities as well as in the Jungian community. But I think what, for me, what none of us have really understood up until this point is that it was actually Jung's personal mythos that led to the formulation of the 12 steps. And I actually would even maybe go so far as to say that the steps are, in a sense, a Jungian myth. And interestingly, regarding this sort of Jungian myth or this Jungian tradition, right, is at the root of it sits the archetype of the alcoholic. And if you were here last session, that's what we talked about: the trickster, shaman, alcoholic archetype, right? That's sort of at the basis of this story. And I do want to say here up front, this information does come out of the book that I've just published, The Shadow of a Figure of Light. And it is available for purchase at both chironpublications.com as well as my website, cody-peterson.com. They told me to shill it. I'm so sorry if this is annoying. And we'll move right along. So, all right, when it comes to the creation myth of the 12 steps, right? We sort of have this this kind of story that we tell, and to really kind of sum it up, it basically says that the 12 steps are a reformulation of the Oxford group principles that Wilson was familiar with. And he just kind of rewrote them and added to them, and voila, we have the 12 steps. And what I want to do is take this quite a bit deeper than that. And to kick it off, I want to tell kind of a little snippet from William Schaberg's book, Writing the Big Book, which is a really it's a great piece of writing, and it's really good history. And he tells us that the chapter "There is a Solution," which is now chapter 2 in the Big Book, was always meant to be chapter 1. So when Bill was writing the Big Book, "There is a Solution" was going to come first. They only put it as chapter 2 later on when they decided to put Bill's story first. And Schaberg also shows that the early drafts of "There is a Solution" actually start out with the story of Roland Hazard meeting Carl Jung in Switzerland, that Roland had gone to Switzerland to be treated by the famous psychiatrist, and that the psychiatrist had told him, that he couldn't help him, that Roland would need a vital spiritual experience. And Schaberg even goes so far as to state that "There is a Solution" can be understood as Bill's declaration of independence from alcoholics or from the Oxford group, his declaration of independence from the Oxford group. And so sort of with that container, I guess, I want to just really jump right in and ask what role did the psychologist play? Also in "There's a Solution," that's when Wilson introduces the varieties of religious experience. That was written by this guy, William James. Of course, then we have Carl Jung. Bill Wilson, he sort of dubbed each of these men co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? And so the question we want to ask is, what role do they play? Because to begin with, it's very safe to say that Wilson was at best only vaguely familiar with their vast scholarship. So James and Jung are both extremely erudite. Their books are very large, long. It requires they're hard to read. They're hard to get through. And Bill wasn't super familiar with what they had to say. So their nature, the nature of their influence upon the 12 steps and upon Alcoholics Anonymous is not necessarily theoretical, right? And I think it's at least a little bit ironic that what Wilson adopts from these two men, these two scientists, was the spirituality of the 12 steps, right? And that's an interesting I guess, intersection. William James in the Varieties of Religious Experience often speaks of this thing he calls the science of religion. And that seems to be a key concept that Wilson probably took away from his reading of it in early sobriety. But I would even go a step further and say that what Wilson actually inherited from these two psychologists is the concept of a personal mythos. And we talked about that a little bit last week, but we're going to get into it more this week. And really that is, we capture that concept in the tradition of our storytelling, right? Wilson calls them our personal adventures, what we used to be like, what happened, and what we're like now. And really, okay, so Bill's own personal adventure, like all adventures into the world of the mythical, begins with his own plunge into the dark. And then in November of 1934, Ebby T comes around bringing the good news. And December 11th of 34, Bill checks himself into Towns Hospital for the last time. And while he's there, Ebby brings him a copy of William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience. And sometime, maybe then, maybe at a different date, assumingly, Ebby tells Bill the story of Roland's meeting with the famous psychiatrist Carl Jung. Now, Ebby had gotten sober the summer previously in Vermont, and he'd become sort of a protege of Roland Hazard. And when Ebby comes around, he tells Bill about his newfound religious conviction, right? William James calls such experiences religious conversions. And this is what Bill has to say about it. He says, Ebby had in effect been raised from the dead, suddenly taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he had ever known. Had this power originated in him? Obviously it had not. There had been no more power in him than there was in me at that minute, and that was none at all. And so, and the thing about this story is, like so many of us, right? Like, and I would even go so far as to say perhaps like most Westerners or most people of European descent or whatever, Bill had his own doubts about this sort of miraculous tale. He had serious misgivings about religion. And this is what Bill says. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind, or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of a czar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. I have since talked with scores of men who felt the same way. What I find interesting about both Bill Wilson as well as Carl Jung is that they each had their finger on the pulse of what it means to experience a psychological transformation in the modern era. And Wilson tells us that he says, I have worked with scores of men who felt the same way. And Bill even wrote an entire chapter called We Agnostics, right? And that's that again, he gained this knowledge by working with so many newcomers. And I want to say what Bill's defining here is what we call in the program the spiritual malady. Bill calls it the spiritual malady in the book. And so many academics have sort of wrestled with this same phenomenon in the modern West. Karen Armstrong, who's one of my favorite authors, she calls it a spiritual crisis, right? And I'm calling it a culture-wide spiritual crisis. And in his own quest for meaning, Carl Jung wrestles with the same quandary, which we'll see in some of the upcoming slides. The thing about this is, though, is that the academics, right, they use different language to describe this spiritual malady than we do. And for example, Jung might say something like this: the conventional interpretation of Western mythological symbols no longer serves its purpose. Due to that fact, the symbols have lost their numinosity or their power to transform the psyche. So that's sort of like the academic speak, right? In the 12-step world, we basically say, like Wilson, Bill, he couldn't stomach the idea of a czar of the heaven, and lack of power was his dilemma. And so we see both it's basically they're both talking about the same thing. Now, I want to build on this a little bit. James Hollis, who is a great Jungian academic, and speaker. He says that Jungian psychology takes place in the context of the loss of mythic connection. In other words, we have this spiritual malady, right, that Jung describes and that Wilson describes, and that what happens is that Jungian psychology sort of grows out of it, right? It comes in response to it, in response to the culture's deepening spiritual crisis. But so right away, though, I want to just get right to this and ask. We have to ask ourselves, what is myth, right? And I have this funny little icon here because myth is essentially a four-letter word. For most people who aren't either Jungians or who enjoy reading Joseph Campbell, what is myth, right? We think myth is just absolutely something that's false. And so I want to challenge everyone to try to see this from a different perspective because it helps open up the concepts that Jung was putting forth. So Joseph Campbell, speaking of, he explains that myth is the secret opening through which the inexhaustible energies of the cosmos pour into human cultural manifestation. So, in other words, myth becomes sort of like the imprint that the self leaves upon the natural world. We spoke about the self in the last session. Mythological images are they're reflections, right, of those antithetical powers, the highest and the lowest, that sort of permeate the human psyche. And myth kind of becomes like the conduit that allows us to sort of harness those powers and access the transformative energy that we need. In the last session, I talked about the fact that alcoholism and addiction and other neuroses seem to erupt out of this lack of myth in the culture. And what we're saying today is that mythological images and symbols also sort of burst out of that same sort of framework. And the academics have a word for this. They call it mythopoetics, which I just love this word. It's essentially myth making. It's the creation of myth as a means of self-reflectivity and self-discovery. So, for example, we spoke of Jung's conception of the self last session, and that is essentially and how it came in response to the culture's to the lack of wholeness perceived in the conventional God image, right? So so that's sort of a mythopoesis, I think, is the way you say it. And the archetype of the alcoholic is also an example of mythopoetics, right? It's a paradoxical image of wholeness that comes in response and emerges out of the collective unconscious. So going back to Bill's story, again, he says, I couldn't stomach the idea of the Tsar of Heaven. And yet what happens is Ebby's response to him completely floors him because Ebby just says, why don't you choose your own conception of God? And with that, I dare say that a new myth is born, even the 12 steps. And it grows directly out of the culture's lack of connection. And I call this another immaculate conception because, for example, if the symbol of Jesus was the first immaculate conception, with a little play on the word conception, right? The symbol of Jesus, it was such a moving symbol that it literally would end up permeating Western psychology, right? Whether you believe in Jesus or not. And that was a certain conception. God had become human, and it was a big deal. Now, I think in the modern era, what we're celebrating here is what William James called a pluralistic conception of God. It's something Stephen Herman actually has a book called, I think it's called Spiritual Democracy, which I think is another sort of, it really points to this concept of choosing your own conception of God. And again, we see this expressed in our second tradition, right? That God can manifest himself through the group conscious. And so underlying this is what Jung called the relativity of the God image, right? And this comes in contrast to the cultural conception of God's fixity. And so, I love the idea of the relativity of the God image because what Wilson says is that we may have used an inadequate conception of God, but that it was more powerful than the Almighty Tsar of Heaven in helping us transform ourselves and experience the psychic change. So now, and I love that Stephen brought up this idea of history and in regards to my book that it's not necessarily a history book. I kind of go to some I take some I do make some jumps and stuff in the logic and just try to tell a nice story that's sort of readable and that it would stick with somebody. And I think we have information in the 12 step fellowships that Bill was perhaps guilty of doing the same thing. I mean, there's that old joke, right, that Bill wrote a book called As Bill Sees It, and Lois, his wife, wrote a book called Lois Remembers, and we all kind of laugh at that in the meetings, right? William Shaberg breaches this subject in his book, Writing the Big Book. And he tells us, so what Shaberg tells us is that it's quite probable that the famous meeting between Ebby and Bill that took place in supposedly in Bill's kitchen in 1934 in November, that actually never happened. And on top of that, that Ebby doesn't recall having said that Bill could just choose his own conception of God. That's something Bill sort of fabricated, and it is noteworthy that during those interactions, Ebby was actually the sober one. So it's I mean, you decide who you want to believe. But I think even getting into the weeds on that is really missing the point. This is what William Shaberg says. Bill's recounting of the facts is sometimes so wide of the mark that it can only be explained as willful, conscious myth-making, the creation of a story specifically crafted to deliver a particularly clear image or an unmistakable lesson to the listener. All too often, Wilson's "this is what happened" accounts must be understood and treated as nothing less than parables, as fables he fashioned to instill some hope in the still suffering alcoholic, or to provide an instructive, uncluttered story about the celebrated origins of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, I appreciate that Shaberg goes to such lengths to really try to let Bill off the hook for his his being loose with the truth, if you will. But the thing is, what we're going to see here is that Wilson was actually in good company in taking this approach, right? Because the same, and we could call it the trickster element that sort of had grasped Wilson's tongue and his pen as he was formulating this myth, was the same one that seems to have captured even Carl Jung. And here's the thing about myth, okay? The defining characteristic of myth is that it is true across any number of frameworks. And the historical framework or the historical context is the least important one. Myth is archetypal. And this is what we looked at in the previous session. And Karen Armstrong tells us that myth has been loosely defined as something that in some sense happened once, and yet in another sense, it is something which happens all the time in every human life. So the bottom line is that regarding Bill's story, regardless of the facts surrounding its historicity, it's true because it's something that's happened more than once, and in another sense, it happens all the time. And I also like this quote too in terms of the 12-step practice, right? Because when we learn to see the 12 steps as a myth, right? And it's maybe a loose definition, yes, but seeing it in such a way allows us to view the 12 steps through the lens of Jungian psychology, which, as we saw in the last session, is a really powerful experience, right? And so in terms of the steps, we work the steps in order one time with a sponsor, right? That's like that happens once. But then in another way, the steps maybe begin to work us, right? And we begin to find ourselves kind of in any number of the steps at any given time, right? And then but even deeper than that, there's a way in which the 12 steps actually sort of help to define the human condition, right? By the fact that every ego is powerless. Every ego suffers from a delusion of control or a delusion of sovereignty or an assumption of omniscience, to use the Jungian terms. And that so every human being is caught up in the drama that's symbolized by the 12 steps, even if they're only stuck on step one. So as we work backwards then from Bill's story, Okay, that he gets sober, Ebby helps him. We come up to this cat, Roland Hazard. And this is the man who carried the message to Ebby. And he tells Ebby to move into the cavalry mission in New York City. And then that's when Ebby in November carries the message to Bill. And then, as we say, the rest is history. Now, at a certain point, we know that Ebby sat on Jung's couch and was treated by the psychiatrist for his alcoholism. And Bill talks about this in the chapter There Is a Solution. And it was always thought that Roland's treatment with Jung had occurred in 1931, okay? But in the mid-2000s, a few scholars began to piece together the timing of Jung's analysis with Roland, and because contemporary documents began to emerge. Amy Colwell Bloom and Cora Finch were two scholars who showed that Roland's treatment actually had occurred in May of 1926. And I want to bookmark that date because it becomes extremely important. It becomes very important as we examine the Jungian influence on the 12 steps. So Amy Colwell Bloom, she published an article in the American Psychological Association in 2006 in their journal. And this is what she says. Now that the year of Roland Hazard's initial analysis has been clarified through primary source material, there is a fresh opportunity to draw out Jung's historical effect on Alcoholics Anonymous. Future work could approach the material by constructing an exposition of Jung's theory as it emerged historically, including the point at which Roland Hazard stepped into the analytical hour and began an interface with Jung's emerging theory. So in a big way, that's actually sort of the thesis of my book, okay? And essentially what she's saying is that we can understand Jung's influence upon AA by sort of examining Jung's kind of clinical method of approach in May of 1926. And I think that that's very insightful. However, what most people, what we had all missed up until now is that, and I'm so grateful that I was able to kind of piece this narrative together, right? Is the fact that in May of 1926, Jung was fresh off the discovery of his own personal myth. And actually, Dr. Herman, he really helped me to really put this story together and understand the timing, right? And Jung wrote about this time literally 40 years later. He says, thus it is, I have now, and this is on page 1 of his biography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Thus it is, I have now undertaken in my 83rd year to tell my personal myth. I can only tell stories. Whether or not the stories are true is not the problem. The only question is whether what I tell is my fable, my truth. And so this quote is direct commentary on the information that I'm going to be sharing today. So a lot of the slides that I'm going to pull, they come from the book Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And I think it's safe to say that it was Jung's personal myth that played into the formulation of the 12 steps far more than any of his sort of psychological theories. And today I want to show how that myth developed in Jung's mind and sort of his own history, his personal history, as to how that came about, and then how it kind of circles back and ends up becoming the central sort of component of his analysis with Roland Hazard. And I want to say, underlying this whole thing is the archetype of the alcoholic, as you'll see very shortly. So in order to understand Jung's personal myth, we've got to go back to Clark University in 1909. And right here, I definitely have to put in a plug for Dr. Herman's book. And I've got my copy right here. It's all marked up, as you can see. That he really delves into this history with Jung at Clark University. And there was an interesting tidbit of synchronicity that was taking place in my life when I began to learn about this, because my friend Billy N., who many of you probably know, was also he was also talking to me about this Clark University meeting and like what had happened there. And there was something about it that just spoke to him and Dr. Herman as well, as like, how does this play into the formulation of AA? And so what had happened was Stanley Hall was at Clark University, and he was a former student of William James. And in 1909, he put on a seminar at Clark University, and he invited 26 of the world's foremost psychologists to attend. And among those he invited was, of course, William James, and also Sigmund Freud, who's pictured there, on the right of center, first row, and then next to him is Carl Jung, who was still a young man at the time, and was actually already a favorite protege of Sigmund Freud. And I want to do just a quick kind of historical sketch on Jung. So he was born in 1875 to a pastor of the Swiss Reformed Church, and 8 of his uncles were pastors. So he was really sort of inundated with Christian dogmatism growing up. And he was a bit of a rebel, not like me and you, though. He was more of like an academic rebel. And so he began searching heady philosophical books as a kid. He read Goethe, he read Nietzsche, and he read Meister Eckhart when he was 15. Herman points that out in his book, Doorways to the Self. And Jung said that Meister Eckhart was his favorite ancient author because he had showed him the breath of life, right? Or spiritus. And when he went to college, he studied medicine, but then he transitioned into the growing field of psychology, which was still pretty young kind of branch of science back then. And he started working as the director of a renowned hospital in Zurich, I think, right around 1900. And during that time, he started sending copies of his own books and reviews to Freud, hoping to get Freud's attention, and it worked. And they finally met face to face in 1907, and the story goes that their initial conversation lasted for 13 hours. Then in 1909, Jung and Freud traveled from Europe across the ocean on this boat, the George Washington, and to attend the seminar at Clark. And while they're aboard the vessel, Freud asked Jung if he would interpret one of his dreams. And then he admitted that he had held back a key piece of information in the dream for fear of tarnishing his reputation. And so what this reveals between Jung and Freud is this sort of uncomfortable dynamic that existed between them. Jung would essentially come to understand Freud as being really kind of more interested in proving his own theories and sort of guarding them than discovering more truth about them. And I think James ends up sort of sharing the same perspective. So of course, William James, he would be headlining, if you will, at this conference, and because of what transpires here, really, William James, in spite of all of his garnered fame, he was to become the godfather of both AA as well as analytical psychology. James had been teaching at Harvard since 1872. He offered the first class on American soil in experimental psychology in 1875, and he gave the first doctorate of psychology to one of his students, who was actually Stanley Hall, in 1878. And again, all of this information is in Herman's book, Doorways to the Self. Now, in 1902, James had put out his magnum opus called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And most of us here are probably familiar with that book, at least with the title. Varieties was based on a series of lectures that James had given a few years previously, known as the Gifford Lectures. And when it was published, it quickly became required reading for many university courses around the world. And this really made James sort of put it right to the top of the pile, right? The academic pile, right? For generations to come. I mean, we still celebrate William James today. And this book was destined to shape the course of both psychology and religion well into the 20th century and beyond, mostly because of the way it influences Carl Jung and Bill Wilson. A couple of the ideas that he puts forth in the book, just real briefly, one is called radical empiricism, a subjective measure of the truth, which states that the effects of religious or spiritual conversions can be studied and verified, while what causes them cannot. So this is sort of like maybe the seedling of the idea of God as you understand him, right? It's that we don't know exactly what causes these religious conversions to come about, but what we do know is how effectual they are, and we can study their effects, and we see people's lives change. The other concept that he puts forth in The Varieties of Religious Experience, which became really important to Jung later on, was the psychology of religious experience, right? And this sort of speaks to the importance of the spiritual element in the process of psychological transformation. And it's kind of in contrast to the Freudian view, which held that the need for religion stems from unresolved trauma. On the other hand, James is sort of saying, like, no, psychology is more about allowing a person to find to discover the self, right? And to just to conjoin what he called the divided self, right? And so that rather than just resolving trauma, there's more of like a spiritual element in these transformations. And obviously that's an idea that Jung was going to really run with later on. So and what happens when they get to Clark is that James and Jung are able to sort of get away for a couple times, for a couple hours, and have these private meetings. And I've been thinking about what maybe took place during those meetings, and it kind of struck me that I was reading James's biography, just kind of poking through it here and there. And what struck me about William James was that it seemed to me that in his personal life, right, in his personal letters to his wife and his journals and stuff, he was obsessed, if you will, with the idea of having a mystical spiritual experience. Like it seems to me that the great question he wrestled with personally was whether or not he had had his own religious conversion. And he would, there's evidence that I mean, I read in Michael Pollan's book that James would use nitrous oxide as a way to experience the mystical. On another occasion, James hiked up a really steep mountain and essentially was like hyperventilating almost, but had kind of like a mystical spiritual experience from doing that. And so it makes sense then that when the two of them get together, right, and if they really had like an intimate connection, which Jung kind of says that they do, then they sort of it appears that they're really talking about this personal spiritual stuff. And William Kolsch, who was a professor of history at Clark University, and Billy Ann actually sent me this book when I was writing my book, and this quote comes from that book. It's called Incredible Daydream, by the way. Kolsch says, James was far more impressed with Jung than with Freud, and the regard was mutual. They had a long evening conversation at Hall's house, discussing such topics as parapsychology and the psychology of religious experience, which James had opened up a few years before in his famous Gifford lectures, and which Jung was to develop far more fully after his break with Freud. And so and this is where, for me, Dr. Herman really kind of, blew everything open for me. Because and in his book, Doorways to the Self, he speaks about sort of the nature of William James's influence upon Carl Jung, and this becomes really important in the story of AA and the 12 steps. And it's actually, interestingly, it's kind of like it's not well known or well accepted in Jungian circles. I had to actually kind of fight with my editor about it. And she really made me put more information in my book to sort of back up the claim that William James sort of played almost the role as a spiritual guru on Carl Jung at that time. And this is what Dr. Herman says in his book, Doorways to the Self. He says, in 1913, Jung said that he had lost contact with his soul back in 1902. The basic attitude Jung found in William James, and that so appealed to him when he rediscovered his soul after meeting James in 1909 at Clark, is a similar one he discovered first in adolescence when he studied Eckhart. In other words, what happens in these private meetings at Clark is that Jung's sort of adolescent thirst for spiritual connection, or his thirst for wholeness, is reignited. And he sort of gets back on the path towards the breath of life. And yeah, and this, so as we're going to see, this really leads into into the spiritual quest, right? This personal mythos. It's what leads to the formulation of the 12 steps. So of course, after the conference at Clark, Jung kind of went back to life in Europe, and Jung and Freud begin to separate even more. Jung is kind of going on his own direction, and by 1913, Freud had had enough, and he wrote a letter to Jung. He enumerated all of his character defects as he had seen him, and basically ends the letter saying, "I propose we abandon our relations entirely." And the two of them never spoke again. But I guess it didn't matter much, because Jung was already well on his way to differentiating himself from Freud's school of thought, which is called psychoanalysis, by the way. And Jung's first real effort towards sort of encompassing his own myth or having his own, getting back on the spiritual path, comes about when he writes his book, Symbols of Transformation, in 1912. And this book really heralded Jung's broadening understanding of the role that mythological imagery plays in the process of psychic change. And in 1952, Jung rewrote the book, and he took out all of the psychoanalytical terms from it, and he rewrote the foreword. And what I want to say here is that, so I want to keep in mind, Jung is writing this with 40 years of distance between him, his initial writing of the book. So he, hindsight is 2020, and he's telling us how impactful this moment was for him, and it's really going to kick us off into the history. So Jung says this book, Symbols of Transformation, became a landmark set upon the spot where two ways divided. It laid down the path I would follow for the next few decades of my life. Hardly had I finished the manuscript when it struck me what it means to live with a myth and what it means to live without one. The psyche is not of today. Its ancestry goes back many millions of years. Individual consciousness is only the flower and the fruit of a season, sprung from the perennial rhizome beneath the earth, and it would find itself in better accord with the truth if it took the existence of this rhizome into its calculations. For the root matter is the mother of all things. So I suspected that myth had a meaning which I was sure to miss if I lived outside it in the haze of my own speculations. I was driven to ask myself in all seriousness, what is the myth you are living? I found no answer to this question and had to admit that I was not living with a myth or even in a myth, but rather in an uncertain cloud of theoretical possibilities which I was beginning to regard with increasing distrust. So in the most natural way, I took it upon myself to get to know my myth, and I regarded this as the task of tasks. I simply had to know what unconscious or preconscious myth was forming me from what rhizome I sprang. And so what happens here is that Jung really sets out on a journey. He says that's going to it's going to take a few decades for it to actually play out. And he talks about that in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And so in 1914, Jung begins writing the book called The Red Book. In 1917, he introduces his conception of the self in what is now volume 7 of the collected works, 2 essays on analytical psychology. And then in 1921, he publishes his book, is called Psychological Types, which is a really important book and is still sort of being, I think that the typology is still being used today in many different arenas of psychological analysis. And then in 1923, Jung meets this guy, Jaime de Angulo, and he's the famously eccentric Bay Area anthropologist. And Jaime was also a self-proclaimed drunkard, and so I think it's safe to say that he was an alcoholic, but he was a lot more than just that, right? So as Herman talked about in his introduction, dozens of books have been written about Jaime. So he was an artist. He liked to draw these cute little sketches, which they're very good. He was also a poet. So there's books of poetry written by him. And he also was instrumental in establishing the anthropology department at UC Berkeley. So, and some of this stuff is sort of legend at this point regarding Jaime. The reason being that he was kind of worshipped by all of these very important Bay Area literary people. Jaime studied native customs. He cataloged native language. He was very good at it. He would go out and help tribes who were losing their language to kind of try to document it and write it down. The native traditions were under attack during that time by the federal government. So Jaime was really useful and helpful in trying to sort of preserve the culture and the language and the secrets and whatever he could do to help. So he wrote a lot of books, he wrote a lot of papers, but he was also a drunk. And Jaime seems to be the kind of drunk that would try to offend anyone he possibly could, right? The more you dig into the story of Jaime, the more you realize just how kind of wild he was. So Gary Snyder says that Jaime was a cross-dressing, gun-toting bisexual who liked to ride bareback naked through Big Sur. And that about makes sense. He was friends with many influential authors. Ezra Pound is the one who said he was Gary Snyder's hero. He knew Allen Ginsberg. Jack Kerouac makes references to Jaime in his writings. And actually, it was Stephen Herman's love for Jaime's connection to this literary scene, I think, is what kind of drew him to study Jaime and to end up writing the unpublished essay that sort of led into this talk. So Jaime is, by all means, still considered a cult hero even today. It's safe to say that he was what we would call the first hippie. He was the grandfather of the beatnik movement. And I have this written here. Without Jaime, there is no counterculture in the Bay Area. There are no drum circles for white people. Wah, wah, wah. And dare I say it, no Grateful Dead. But for all that's been said about Jaime, no one really ever connected him to the emergence of the 12 steps before. And though it might be a little bit of a stretch, I think I make a pretty good case why it at least must be considered. So come along with me on this magical journey. It's about to get weird. So basically, Jaime graduated from Johns Hopkins in 1912 with a medical degree. And then he used money that he had got from his recently estranged father and bought a cattle ranch in Northern California on the eastern slopes of Mount Shasta. And one day while he was working the land, he met some native people from the Achumawee tribe. So this is a branch of the Pitt River tribe. And being a linguistics maestro and also having a deep love for anthropology, Jaime was able to really kind of hit it off with some of the tribes people, and he became very close with them. Now, in particular, he was drawn to a young shaman among them named Sukmet. And I don't think this is a picture of Sukmet, by the way. But what Jaime has to say about Sukmet is interesting. He says, "How many ditches have we shared for a bed with a bottle of firewater?" And so one of the advantages Jaime had was his love of drinking, and also the natives that he would hang out with, they also like to drink. And so Jaime he kind of used the alcohol to sort of get in with them and become close with them, and then he could ask them questions and study and write. And so he was sort of doing this research, right? And all sort of behind the firewater. And Sukmet was clearly Jaime's lover. There's a funny story about Jaime that D.H. Lawrence at one time had made a pass at Jaime, but Jaime turned him down because he didn't like the way D.H. Lawrence smelled. So yeah, it makes you wonder what Sukmet smelled like and looked like. But what interested Jaime the most here regarding the Achumaway was their religious rites, okay? And this is what he has to say. "The Achumaway don't need so many ceremonies to understand the life of the world in trees, in the rivers, in the rocks. They have the wonder stuff loose and free on tap." So it's very well documented that Jaime struggled with substance abuse. But the question kind of remains what the wonder stuff really was. And so scholars have kind of puzzled over it. In his unpublished essay, Herman explains that it's hard to know what the wonder stuff on tap really was, but whatever it was from a feeling standpoint, the real thing. Authentic religious experience that connected him to the self in its non-dual aspect. And I really like what Dr. Herman says here. Having read Jaime, this story about Jaime and studied it a little bit from the perspective of a person who also struggles with substance abuse, I think that Herman's words here are really insightful. He says that from the feeling standpoint, whatever the wonder stuff was, it was the real thing for Jaime. It was an authentic religious experience. And that reminds me of what Dr. Silkworth says when he says that the alcoholic is restless, irritable, and discontented unless he can again experience the sense of ease and comfort which comes at once by taking a few drinks. So there's that. But as powerful as alcohol is on a person who is alcoholic or who has alcoholic tendencies, it still seemed to be, and this is where my intuition kicked in when I read the essay, is that I've been to those mountains, right? I went to a rainbow gathering in like 2003 or 4 on the eastern slopes of Mount Shasta in a town called Likely, Nevada. And for some reason, the whole hippie thing and everything, it started to really kind of dawn on me. And I kind of had this hunch, and I thought, I bet Jaime was using these psychedelic mushrooms, Amanita pantherine. And it seemed to me that that's what the wonder stuff might have been, right? And I was really excited when I kind of I stumbled on this information like in my mind, and I started to kind of work it into the book. But then I was like, well, I'm going to do some more research because I want to. If I'm going to put this in there, I want to make a good case for it. So I did some digging, and I found an article published in a journal. I think it's at UC Davis, the University of California, Davis or Merced or somewhere. I can get the article for anyone who's interested, but it was actually written by the Achumawee headman in the 1980s, a gentleman named Floyd Buckskin, with his co-author, who was an anthropologist. Her name is Arlene Benson, and this is what they say. There is evidence that Achumawee people living in the Fall River Valley southeast of Mount Shasta now use a yellow mushroom with hallucinogenic properties, Amanita pantherine, for religious purposes, and have done so at least since the early part of the 20th century. Now, I want to point out right here that Buckskin, in his essay, makes it extremely clear that the use of psychedelics is not a widespread event, and not a widespread practice in Native American culture. Like, and contrary to popular belief, right? That it's not a widespread practice. There's less. I think it's like 2 or 3 tribes that where it's been documented that they actually do use psychedelics for religious purposes. So this is a very sort of particular instance of that having taken place. Now, Buckskin explains and probably helps us understand why Jaime doesn't ever come out and say what exactly the wonder stuff actually is. Buckskin tells us that the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms went underground along with other Native American practices. And the reason is because the U.S. government had been waging a cultural war against the Native American. We talked about that last session. This is, again, it's a photograph of 15,000 buffalo skulls, right? The U.S. government was trying to decimate the religion of the Native American in order to I guess, wield more power over them. And so in response to this, then the native culture, the natives had began to put their religious practices, just send everything underground so that they could preserve them. So, but Jaime was a special case. He had adopted their myth. So he vowed to keep their secret. And he vowed to protect the rights of the natives. And this is what I write in The Shadow of a Figure of Light, quoting Jaime. So, thus, while Carl Jung was gathering meaning as it emerged from the perennial rhizome within the human psyche, Jaime the drunkard had discovered it in a variety of magic fungus, which he came to believe didn't just grow from the roots of certain trees, but was born out of the mother as a gift from the spirits of American Indian ancestors who were themselves incarnated within the soil, the trees, the rocks. In America, Jaime writes, the soil is teeming with the ghosts of Indians, holding that Westerners will never find spiritual stability until they learn to recognize the American Indians as their spiritual ancestors. And so what Jaime is saying here is, rather than oppress Native religion and culture and Native people, that we white Americans would do better to actually go a step far further and not just allow them to practice their religion, but to begin to understand it as part of our own heritage and as part of our own see them as our spiritual ancestors. So, and Jaime spent so much time out in the woods with these people from the tribe that he actually invented kind of a new approach to anthropological inquiry called going native. And this allowed Jaime to make a scene for himself in Berkeley, right? And to become kind of a well-known figure and to help establish the anthropology department. So, but then one summer, while they were visiting on a field trip with UC, they were visiting Oaxaca, Mexico. which is by all intents the psychedelic mecca of the world. And Jaime got blackballed from the university because he stopped coming to class while they were in Mexico. But again, Jaime was more interested in participating in the indigenous ceremonies and protecting the indigenous traditions than he was in participating in what he called museum anthropology. And we see this kind of in his response to his boss, Kroeber, when he wrote later about this incident. He said, decent anthropologists don't associate with drunkards who go rolling in ditches with shamans. And so Jaime was very dedicated to the tribes and to the native peoples. By the way, this is a mural of Maria Sabina. She is known as the mushroom shaman, and she was actually a contemporary of Jaime in Oaxaca during that time. So I don't know whether they ever met up or anything, but it's certainly an interesting piece of the story. Now, so the woman on the bottom right, that woman's name with that fabulous visor, her name is Carrie Fink, aka Carrie Baines, and she is Jaime's ex-wife. And so she had spent quite a bit of time with Jaime in the mountains, but they had gotten a divorce. She had a child, and she realized that Jaime's kind of life in the mountains wasn't a place for rearing children, especially a little girl. And so they were fighting a custody battle, and Carrie moved to Switzerland to seek out help from Dr. Jung, who's actually pictured here with the hat. But they were pretty amiable, I guess, in their split up, and so they continued corresponding through letters, right? And often Carrie would share the letters with Jung, because again, Jung had just written Psychological Types in 1921. So Jung was very interested in indigenous culture and indigenous religion. And by the time Jung actually meets Jaime in 1923, Jung already knew all about sort of Jaime's lifestyle, his trips in the woods, his alcoholism, his inability to get along in the Western world. But he was intrigued that this Spanish drunkard had been able to gather so much firsthand knowledge and experience with these tribes. And so he invited Jung to Ballingen, to this kind of castle-like structure that Jung had begun building a couple years previously. This was his own religious retreat, if you will, his own spiritual getaway. So during their time together, I mean, they're there, and they actually went camping. So they rode across the lake onto a little island, and then spent a week out there on the island. And I'm sure Jaime, lit fire with sticks and built shelter, and maybe caught some fish with his bare hands, or who knows, he had all kinds of skills, I'm sure, that his native friends had taught him. But during their time together, it seems reasonable that Jung begins to recognize a few things about Jaime. One being Jaime's own quest for connection and spiritual, for a spiritual connection. This is what Herman writes in his essay. He says, like Jung, Jaime was looking for his own personal myth, his own subjective story, his own way to truth. And I think it's safe to say that Jung probably recognized that as well during his interactions with Jaime. That Jaime's trips in the mountains were of a deeply spiritual nature, regardless as to whether or not they sort of hinged on intoxication, right? But that was Jaime's way of connecting to the spiritual element. So Jung saw this as a way that Jaime could stay connected to what he had called the primitive. And Herman mentioned that in his intro. Again, the word primitive is not meant to be derogatory. It was kind of in vogue back then, and Jung used it as a reference to this sort of instinctual or primal connection to spirituality and to nature, right? It's like a primal urge for cosmogonic connection that all humans share deep inside the collective unconscious. And what I'm proposing is that this sort of insight into seeing Jaime and understanding Jaime's journey in the mountains is what allows Jung to begin to piece together what is needed to recover from alcoholism, right? Because Jung would have sort of seen the shaman / trickster working in Jaime, and his sort of unconscious identification, if you will, with the archetype of the alcoholic. And sadly, while they're there, Jaime's house burns down back in Berkeley, and so their time is cut short. He had to return home, and then on the eve of the new year of 1924, Jung actually sent Jaime $500 to help him get back on his feet, which is actually the equivalent of $10,000 today. So, and I do find that also kind of an interesting piece of the story in terms of Jung's relationship to Jaime, right? Like this certain closeness that they seem to share may say something about Jung's relationship to alcoholics in general. Now, back on the West Coast, Jaime meets these two beautiful people, Tony and Mabel Dodge Lujan. They were from the Taos Pueblo in New Mexico, and they were wintering in the Bay Area. And they really hit it off with Jaime, and they decided to invite him to Taos later in 1924. And so what was going on during that time is, in response to the campaign of cultural genocide, which was called Kill the Indian, Save the Man, and which included them taking Native youth and forcing them into boarding schools, where they would then prohibit them from speaking their native tongue, eating native food, practicing native religion. So they were really trying to wipe out the culture. And in response to this, the Taos had begun a program sort of diplomacy, I guess, where they would invite influential Western authors to come to their community in New Mexico and participate in some of the tribe's religious rites, and then they could go back into sort of the Western world or Western culture and essentially spread the word that the idea of like trying to eradicate this culture is really is unnecessary. And so Jaime gets invited partly because Tony likes him, but then on the other hand too, Jaime already he's kind of well known in the anthropology scene. He speaks native tongue. He's been cataloging native language, and he already knows some religious secrets too. So they go ahead and offer him an invitation as well. And what's interesting is it appears from reading Dr. Herman's essay and just what I know about Jaime is that when he gets to Taos, he seems like he's a little bit dismayed because the Taos, they're not using the wonder stuff. And Jaime wrote to Carrie, this is where he mentions the wonder stuff. He says, I may never find anything of interest to my special line of research among the Pueblo. And he says, I prefer the California tribes. They have the wonder stuff loose and free on tap. So Jaime seems to be a little dismayed because the religious ceremonies that he was expecting, they're just not participating in those. And Jaime goes on to say in that letter to Carrie, he says, without knowing it, I wanted black magic from Tony. He, not being a magician, quietly refused. He says, I only have spirituality to give you. Take it or leave it, but don't give me headaches. Jung said all that to me last summer, but I wasn't ripe to understand them then. I am more so now. And so, and Jaime in this letter, he refers to this idea of the paradoxical knife edge, right? So it's obvious that Jaime had discovered meaning and value through what he's calling here black magic, right? Through the intoxicative ceremonies of the Achumaway, right? And what Tony tells him and what Jung tells him is, hey man, you need spirituality. Like you need something that will sustain you in real life, man, not out in the mountains, but when you've got to take care of your family, you've got to take care of your kid. Like, you're not really pulling your weight. And Jaime says that he feels like he's going to be torn asunder by this paradoxical knife edge that was kind of sort of defining him now. And this is, I think, an instance where Jung responds in the letter to Jaime through the letter, writing, in short, Jaime, you cannot content yourself to live on a paradoxical knife edge. The myth you adopt has to symbolize the suitable fusion of the pairs of opposites in a way that makes it possible for you to function in a civilized society without shutting out the primitive. And so this response right here, it seems to kind of hint at Jung's growing understanding of alcoholism and addiction, and that he's kind of he's essentially telling Jaime that in order to recover, he's gonna have to experience the coniunctio oppositorum, right? That thing we talked about last week, right? That the fusion of the highest and the lowest, right? Spiritus contra spiritum. And what Jaime really needed was a shaman that could lead him inward, right? And it's unclear whether Jung got Jaime on the couch the previous summer, but that doesn't really matter, I guess, because what Jung is able to learn from Jaime is that the alcoholic is on a quest for meaning and a quest for connection, and that it's a spiritual journey. And I think that for me, telling this story specifically, this sort of legend, if you will, that's loosely based on historical fact, I guess, is that I feel like this story does really tell sort of it helps to elucidate what the alcoholic is searching for, right? And how much meaning the alcoholic is finding during active alcoholism or drug addiction and active drug addiction or whatever it may be. Herman had hinted earlier that what Jaime was experiencing in terms of the feeling function was real, authentic spiritual connection. But later in the essay, Herman goes on to explain that Jaime is that his lifestyle is causing him to suffer a spiritual bypass. And a spiritual bypass is defined as the use of one's spirituality, spiritual beliefs, spiritual practices, and spiritual life to avoid experiencing the emotional pain of working through psychological issues. This trap entails actively seeking spiritual highs as a means to avoid processing underlying psychological pain. So, spiritual bypassing is an interesting concept. It seems to be sort of a buzzword when I give this presentation. And I think what it sort of hints at here is, if we combine this and as we look at this story the way I'm telling it, is that the essential function of alcohol and other types of intoxicating substances upon the alcoholic is really, it actually produces a spiritual bypass. And it appears that from the few sort of interactions and documented what's left of Jung's communications with Jaime is that Jung had begun to understand this aspect of alcoholism through those interactions, right? That the alcoholic is suffering from a spiritual bypass through the use of alcohol. So this is how Jung explains it in the 1961 letter to Wilson so many years later, that the alcoholic's craving for liquor is the equivalent of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, in medieval language, for union with God. So, and this is the case that I would make, is that Jung's interactions with Angulo become the treasure trove of wisdom from which he pulls when he treats Roland Hazard a little while later. On a whim in January of 1925, Jung decides to take a trip to the States. And while he's here, Jaime, it appears that Jaime kind of comes up with this idea like, hey man, we should go to Taos. Like, let's go to Taos. And so Jung agrees, and Jaime is able to convince the Taos elders to let the Swiss doctor come. And so Jung makes his way to the American Southwest, and his first stop is on the is at the Grand Canyon, on the South Rim. And he sends a telegram to Jaime from El Tovar Lodge, which is still there. And he tells Jaime, go rent a car and pick us up. We're going to take a trip. And he says, all expenses paid, Jaime, just get your butt down here with a car. So Jaime, he shows up a few days later with a Chevrolet, and Jung and Jaime, and then I think one or two other people. Actually, I think one of them was Rockefeller's grandson, I think, was among the group that went. They hop in that Chevrolet and they take off across the desert. And, this would have been an extended road trip back then. It's not like they were flying, 85 miles an hour down I-40, right? They were actually driving on Route 66 that was under construction at the time. And I think they could go about 30 or 35 miles an hour. So it probably took them a couple days to get there. And I don't know if you've made the trip, but you go down the San Francisco mountain range out to Gallup and then to Albuquerque and then up the mountain through Santa Fe to Taos. So, and it's safe to say, and it almost appears, from the evidence or what's not there, is that Jung probably got more insight into what it means to be a practicing alcoholic during this time. There's some wild stories about, well, one in particular that I got from Andrew Schelling about maybe something that occurred during this trip. I don't have time to say it right now, but maybe during the question and answer, I can get back to that. And once they get to Taos, the roof of the world, Jung quickly meets up with one of the Taos elders, Mountain Lake. And this is what Jung tells us in the book, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, that him and Mountain Lake they're speaking, and they're talking about why the US government is trying to sort of stamp out their religion. And this is what Jung recalls. He says, after all, Mountain Lake said, we are a people who live on the roof of the world. We are the sons of Father Sun, and with our religion, we daily help our Father to go across the sky. We do this not only for ourselves, but for the whole world. If we were to cease practicing our religion in 10 years, the sun would no longer rise. Then it would be night forever. And so in this interaction, Jung becomes, he tells us that he felt impoverished standing next to this native elder, that this man's connection to the earth and to the sun was so profound and so moving, and that it made Jung realize that in spite of all of his knowledge about psychology and religion, he still, all this time later, was yet to have discovered his own myth, right? And it felt, he left there feeling this sort of, that same spiritual impoverishment that he spoke of. So this sort of reignites he's searching for his myth, right? And he's longing for a connection, the way Mountain Lake had one, and probably Jaime to a certain extent. And they leave Taos, and Jaime just goes back to life in the Bay Area. But Jung shortly thereafter embarks upon another defining trip for him, and another key aspect of the spiritual lineage of the 12 steps, because he goes to Africa. He goes on safari. He goes with Helton Baines. He goes with Carrie Baines now, because Carrie had married Helton, and so they all went to Africa. And that Carrie was Jaime's ex-wife, by the way. So, and while they're on safari, one morning Jung wanders off to meditate, right? And he says, as he sat there contemplating the gigantic herds of gazelle, antelope, and zebra moving forward like slow rivers, the legend of the Taos came rushing back into his mind. And this is what he says: there, the cosmic meaning of consciousness became clear to me. Man, I, in an invisible act of creation, put the stamp of perfection on the world by giving it objective existence. My old Pueblo friend came to my mind. He thought that the raison d'etre of his Pueblo had been to help their father, the sun, to cross the sky each day. I had envied him for the fullness of meaning in that belief, and had been looking about without hope for a myth of our own. Now I knew what it was, that man is indispensable for the completion of creation, that in fact he is the second creator of the world. Human consciousness created objective existence and meaning, and man found his indispensable place in the great process of being. So, this is where Jung then discovers his own myth, and it's a myth of expanding consciousness. And it's a direct sort of psychological reflection of the Taos myth. And I'll explain how. The sun for them was a religious symbol, and the Taos elders helped the sun cross the sky each day, right? So we have the God and the humans, right? If you recall from last session, we spoke about how in myth, the God is typically representative of the self and sort of the expanding consciousness, right? While the human characters represent the ego. And so for Jung, then this myth of expanding consciousness kind of reformulates into the fact that the ego then is really called to help consciousness expand, right? And he called this the individuation, right? That's what we call spiritual awakening. And it's a myth of expanding consciousness because the ego is making the darkness conscious, or it's bringing more and more of the unconscious into the light of consciousness. So that's a myth of expanding consciousness. We also have this same thing sort of happening in the 12 steps. We talked about this last session, that in each of the steps, what's taking place is that we're bringing more of the unconscious into consciousness. And I love step 11 for this, because it says that we sought to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him. Another way of saying that, in perhaps a more Jungian sense, would be that we sought to improve our conscious contact with the self or with the unconscious. And so we're bringing more of, and that really is the purpose of the steps, to bring more of the self into consciousness. And what happens here is so Mountain Lake then becomes Jung's direct sort of spiritual ancestor, right? But also the trickster slash shaman in Jaime, right? Now constellated into the archetype of the alcoholic, is the one who leads Jung towards his own myth of meaning, much the same way that archetype has led so many of us to discover our own myth. Jung was clearly moved by his experience in Taos, and as we saw earlier, he explained, this was the discovery of his own myth. And then here's where we tie this back into Roland, because literally 8 weeks after he returns home from Africa, he meets Roland Hazard, the certain American businessman that Bill Wilson talks about in the big book. And in her essay, Stellar Fire, Carl Jung, A New England Family and the Risk of Antidote, Cora Finch goes through and really kind of lays out what happens in Roland Hazard's life after he meets Jung. And obviously he doesn't stay sober. He gets treated in Jung in 1926, and then in 27, he actually travels to Africa on the same route that Jung had taken. And while he's there, he gets hospitalized for a few months in Africa with liver issues. After that, he goes to London and parties for about a year. Then in 1929, interestingly, Roland buys a piece of property in New Mexico, south of Taos, quite a ways south, not in Taos, but near there. And then in 1932, Roland ends up back in the hospital in New York City, and that's when he joins the Oxford group. He kind of sobers up for a while. In the summer of 34, he helps Ebby get sober, and then, of course, Ebby moves to New York City and carries the message to Bill. So that's how it all sort of connects back. Now, we get to what I call an urban legend, okay? Because Bill Wilson never met Roland Hazard, and he only heard about Roland's meeting with Jung third hand, either through Ebby or perhaps Sever Graves. I think it's Ebby, because Ebby actually traveled to New Mexico with Roland in 1935. So it makes sense that Ebby knew about that. And so what Bill had access to, though, 10 years later, was really not much more than an urban legend at the time. And so what we have in the big book is by no means a direct quote from Dr. Jung, even though Wilson is actually bold enough to put it in quotation marks. And of course, that's part of his own mythopoesis, right? He's trying to make the case that we need to have our own personal experience, that it's not going to come to us through conventional religion. And this is how Wilson recollects that meeting between Roland and Jung. And here we have Jung speaking in the first paragraph, and then Bill's giving commentary in the second. Jung says, here and there, once in a while, alcoholics have had what are called vital spiritual experiences. To me, these occurrences are phenomena. In fact, I've been trying to produce some such emotional rearrangement within you. With many individuals, the methods which I employed are successful, but I have never been successful with an alcoholic of your description. Upon hearing this, our friend was somewhat relieved, for he reflected that, after all, he was a good church member. This hope, however, was destroyed by the doctors telling him that while his religious convictions were very good, in his case, they did not spell the necessary vital spiritual experience. And so that's sort of the message that Wilson is able to glean, through the ether, right, regarding Jung's spiritual prescription to Roland Hazard. And what we see, the common thread that we see, right, even though we don't have Jung's exact words to Roland, this is literally just Bill Wilson making it up, to the best of his memory, third hand. But what kind of the thread that winds through there is this idea of the personal mythos, right? That is the essence of the 12 steps. And now, and in conclusion, basically, so what kind of our own mythos within either AA or the 12 steps is that what Jung opens up for Bill Wilson was the mystery of step 2, that Wilson had learned about step 1 from Dr. Silkworth, right? But that this sort of spiritual experience, the vital spiritual experience, came and that really unlocks step 2. And I'm going to end with a couple quotes from The Shadow of a Figure of Light. So it says, more than anyone else in Jung's career, it was Jaime who revealed to him that the alcoholic needs something more than what his scientific method could produce. Jaime helped Jung gain an appreciation of what Wilson would later classify as step one. We had admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Yet it was Jung's own personal adventure towards a connection to spirit, sparked by William James over a decade earlier, that revealed to him the mystery of step two. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Fate wove their stories together, setting the stage for the transformation of innumerable lives of alcoholics, addicts, and their families, even though James, Jaime, and Jung never got to fully enjoy its fruits. And as we talk about Jaime's legacy, the world, as is usually the case for alcoholics, the world just became increasingly dark for him. He would eventually lose custody of Jimena, and he started to blame Jung for his misfortunes rather than kind of looking at his own part, if you will. In 1933, in a horrible car accident, Jaime was in a car with another woman, and Jaime's child was in the back seat, and the car went off the cliff at Big Sur. That's, if you've been in Big Sur, you know how treacherous the roads can be there. And the accident killed Jaime's child, and it seriously injured Jaime. We don't know who was driving the car, but if you understand Jaime, like, it's pretty safe to say that most likely they were intoxicated. There's so many stories about him and his alcoholism, and actually what happens right after that is that he basically gets strung out on the pain medication that the doctors gave him. So he struggles with that for many years. Eventually he gets divorced from his second wife, and he moves to Berkeley, and he dies in 1950. I think he was a janitor and stuff, so he just kind of he petered out like many alcoholics do. But that said, I think the perspective that we bring, and certainly that I'm trying to bring here, is actually one of celebration, right? I know for those who may not have alcoholism or drug addiction, it might look like we're sort of dragging Jaime's name through the mud. But the truth is, here we celebrate we can celebrate his legacy. Hopefully we can, spread the word about it. This is what I write. Jaime stood at the door knocking, as it were, never realizing that he was holding the key and could have let himself in. Had he been able to heed the advice of Jung or Tony, perhaps the ensuing chain of events, including Wilson's own sobriety and the creation of the 12 steps, would not have come about as it did. By introducing Jaime into the story of AA's creation myth, perhaps we might honor him as the first of many martyrs for the spiritual way of life that he unwittingly helped to create. Indeed, the 12-step fellowships can say of Jaime, as we do of the other countless friends we've lost to the disease, that he died so that we could live. For if Jung hadn't got to know Jaime's struggles so intimately, he may never have recognized that regressive analysis and therapy in general cannot get a real alcoholic sober, regardless of how beneficial it is for them. There's sort of this lingering question that I like to ruminate on is did Jaime ever hear about Alcoholics Anonymous? AA was established in the Bay Area in 1939. By the mid 40s, I'm sure there was multiple meetings per week, probably groups and the whole thing. I think Bill actually traveled to San Francisco in 1949 or 1950 to attend like a little conference there for AA. So, it's very feasible that a guy like Jaime with his sort of history would have at least been, someone might have recommended it to him somewhere along the line. But there's one more thing I want to point out here is that, in addition to celebrating Jaime as one of our own spiritual ancestors, right? I hope that we can all sort of begin to celebrate, Native American culture, and Native American religion, as actually playing a part in our own quest to discover a personal myth, right? Both in AA as well as in the Jungian tradition, as Jaime said, that we can learn to see the natives as our own spiritual ancestors, thereby attaining a much needed measure of spiritual stability. And so I hope that my book, as well as my talk, can help us to begin to do some of that work as well. So, and that's where I'm going to end it. Thank you for coming.
Wow. Thank you, Cody. Wonderful stuff, man.